Have you ever had that feeling, when something that you always thought was like a fundamental part of who you are just vanishes?
Oh, yeah.
And I'm not even talking about like losing your keys or your phone or anything like that. It's more like losing something that defined a whole chapter of your life, and suddenly there's this emptiness.
Yeah. You feel unmoored, like you've lost
Mhm.
an anchor. You start to really question what your foundations are, what's important to you.
It's disorienting, for sure. It makes you wonder what really matters. And that feeling of loss, that's exactly what we're going to explore
Like a
today.
lot of folks.
We are diving deep, and I mean deep, into a Spanish psychological thriller on Netflix. You might have heard of it, The Occupant.
Or, as it's known in Spanish, hogar.
That's right, Hogar. And we're not just doing a typical movie review here. We're going way beyond the surface.
We've got this full film critique we're using as our guide,
Mm.
and it really goes beyond just summarizing the plot. It digs into the themes, the characters, the psychology, the whole shebang.
And believe me, there are layers to unpack here. I mean, the story is about this guy, Javier Munoz. He's an advertising executive. He's fallen on hard times, and he's lost his super stylish apartment.
But it's not just about losing a place to live, is it? It goes deeper than that.
Much deeper. For him, it's like losing a symbol of all his success. And he just can't handle it. He can't let go.
It consumes him, becomes an obsession.
And that brings us to the heart of our deep dive today. What happens when someone's whole identity is wrapped up in their stuff, their status, their possessions? This film and the critique we're using takes that question to some pretty dark places. The critique describes the film as having this creeping intensity, and I think that's spot on.
Yeah, it gets under your skin. And that's what's so valuable about this critique. It's not just about the thrills and chills, but it's looking at the darker side of human nature. What are the societal pressures that can lead someone down this path? It makes you think.
So, structurally, how is the story told? The critique uses the term slow-burning narrative. So this isn't one of those movies that hits you with a jump scare every 5 minutes.
No, it's not about cheap thrills. The tension builds gradually, subtly, almost imperceptibly. It's like a slow, steady climb, and it keeps you on the edge of your seat the whole time.
Right, it's more about psychological suspense than anything else. The premise itself is pretty straightforward, right? A guy loses his apartment. But, as the critique points out, that seemingly simple starting point opens up into this really complex exploration of what's going on inside this guy's head. The critique also highlights the meticulous storytelling of the directors, the Pastor brothers, and of course they point to Javier Gutierrez's performance as being crucial to the whole thing.
Absolutely. The acting is superb. Gutierrez really embodies that descent into obsession. It's disturbingly believable.
So let's talk about the plot itself. Javier loses the apartment, and then what? The critique talks about his gradual descent into manipulation and danger. So it's not like he suddenly becomes this mustache-curling villain, right?
No, it's a much more nuanced process than that. This descent is gradual, a chipping away at his morality, fueled by his utter inability to accept this loss. And remember, it's not just losing a physical space, it's losing what that apartment represents. The success, the status, the life he once had.
It becomes symbolic, yeah, almost like the apartment itself is a stand-in for his whole identity. And without it, he feels lost, incomplete.
The critique even goes so far as to link this to a broader contemporary malaise.
Yeah.
The failure of that whole self-made man mythos. I mean, think about it. How often do we measure our worth based on external achievements?
Yeah.
On what we own? It makes you think about how fragile that sense of identity can be when things fall apart.
Yeah, it really does. It's unsettling to think about.
It is. And the film doesn't shy away from that. The critique suggests that Javier isn't necessarily evil, but he's definitely a product of these societal pressures. He's bought into this idea that success is the be-all and end-all, and when he loses that, he doesn't know who he is anymore. And as the critique points out, the new tenants of the apartment become this target for his resentment. They represent everything he's lost, and he becomes fixated on reclaiming that fantasy of power and status.
And there's this interesting layer to the story, right? Javier used to work in advertising. The critique calls this a subtle but sharp stroke. What is it about his background in advertising that feeds into the events of the film?
It's brilliant, really. The critique highlights how Javier's advertising background makes him a master manipulator. He knows how to shape perception, to craft illusions that sell. And now he's using those same skills to try and regain control of his life, of his narrative. He's basically creating a whole new reality for himself, just like he used to do when he was selling products.
It's almost like he's trying to advertise himself back into a life he no longer has.
Exactly. And that ties into the film's exploration of how easily we can construct and buy into these false realities, how we can deceive ourselves as much as we deceive others. That's a pretty potent metaphor, I think.
Okay, let's talk about the characters a bit more. We've touched on Javier Gutierrez's performance, and the critique really praises the nuance he brings to the role. They talk about his subtle menace and weary bitterness. They make it clear that he doesn't turn Javier into a caricature, which is so important in a psychological thriller.
It's crucial. You have to believe in the character even when they're doing terrible things. And Gutierrez manages to make Javier's descent into obsession both frightening and, in a strange way, sympathetic.
Yeah. You almost feel sorry for him, even as he's making these horrible choices. What about Mario Casas as Tomas, the new occupant? The critique describes him as the unwitting foil to Javier and points out his vulnerability and optimism. How does Tomas's character contrast with Javier and add to the tension?
Tomas is basically everything Javier is not anymore. He's trusting, optimistic, and completely unaware of the danger that's lurking right in front of him. And that contrast, that tension between their personalities, really adds to the suspense. You, as the viewer, see the danger, but Tomas doesn't. And that's a really effective way to create a sense of dread.
Absolutely. It's like watching a slow-motion train wreck about to happen.
Exactly. And then you have Bruna Cusi as Laura, Tomas's wife. The critique mentions her performance as being grounded and understated at first, but they also say that her role becomes increasingly important as the film goes on.
So how does her character evolve over the course of the story?
It's interesting. At the beginning, you might think she's just a supporting character, but as Javier's manipulations become more intense, Laura starts to see through the facade. She becomes this crucial figure in uncovering the truth and reacting to the increasingly disturbing events. And her grounded performance, her reactions, really sell the realism of the situation. It makes the danger feel that much more real.
The critique also mentions the supporting cast, suggesting that these characters reflect different aspects of Javier's own fractured self-image. What do you think they mean by that?
Well, think about the people Javier interacts with. Former colleagues, old friends, even strangers. They're like these little reminders of the life he's lost. They represent the success, the status, the connections that he's desperately trying to cling to. It's like he's seeing pieces of himself reflected in these other people, but he can't quite put the puzzle back together, and that just fuels his obsession even more.
Right, like he's surrounded by ghosts of his past. Moving on to the visual style, the critique describes it as sleek yet oppressive, with a lot of cool, muted tones. How does that contribute to the overall mood and atmosphere of the film?
Oh, the visuals are brilliant. The sleekness reflects that superficial world that Javier is so obsessed with, that world of appearances and status. But there's this underlying sense of oppression, this claustrophobia that's created through the use of these cool, muted colors. It really reflects Javier's emotional state. He's trapped, both literally and figuratively, by his own desires.
And the way the lost apartment is framed by the camera, the cinematography, often presents it as a sort of trophy case of his former life. And they also mention how Javier is frequently isolated visually within the frame. It sounds very deliberate.
Oh, it is. The way the apartment is shot, it becomes this symbol of everything Javier has lost. It's almost like a sacred space to him. And then by isolating him visually, they're highlighting his growing detachment from everyone and everything around him. He's becoming more and more consumed by his obsession to the point where he's completely cut off from reality.
It sounds like they really use the visuals to tell the story. The critique also points out the director's effective use of stillness and silence to build tension. Instead of relying on jump scares, they create a sense of psychological horror. I'm always a fan of that approach. It's much more unsettling, in my opinion.
Me too. The silence, the stillness, it allows the unease to really sink in. You're waiting for something to happen, and that anticipation is almost unbearable. It's a much more sophisticated way to create suspense than just throwing a loud noise at the audience. And, as the critique notes, that sense of tension permeates even the most mundane scenes. You're always on edge, waiting for the other shoe to drop.
It keeps you guessing. So let's talk about tone and pacing. The critique calls the pacing calculated, even though it's a slow burn. So how does that work? How do they manage to keep the story moving forward while still maintaining that slow, deliberate pace?
It's all about the details. Every scene, every interaction is carefully constructed to contribute to the overall narrative. There's no wasted motion. Everything is purposeful, even the silences. And that sense of calculation, of everything being carefully orchestrated, really adds to the suspense. You know that something is coming, but you don't know what or when.
They describe the tone as having a Kafkaesque quality. evoking a sense of inevitable horror and unrelenting bleakness. That doesn't sound like a fun, lighthearted watch.
Definitely not a rom-com.
Yeah.
That Kafka-esque element, it's about feeling trapped, powerless, lost in a system that makes no sense. You can see that in Javier's situation. He's caught in this downward spiral, and he doesn't know how to get out. And the critique is right. There's this overwhelming sense of bleakness. There's no easy resolution, no happy ending. It's a very unsettling film, but it's also incredibly compelling.
The critique sums it up nicely, I think. They call it a social thriller dressed as a domestic one, where the true horror comes from the psychological tension and the implications of what's happening, rather than any explicit violence. It's a different kind of scary.
Absolutely. It gets under your skin in a way that a lot of horror films don't. It's about the human potential for darkness, for obsession, for self-destruction. And it's all the more terrifying because it feels real. It could happen to anyone.
So let's talk about some of the bigger themes and ideas that the film explores. The critique emphasizes this idea of success and self-worth, and it criticizes a certain kind of capitalist ideology where material possessions define a person's value. It seems like that's at the heart of the film's message.
It definitely is. The film is a critique of that obsession with status and material wealth. Javier's attachment to the apartment represents that in a very literal way. He's defined himself by his possessions, by his achievements, and when those are taken away, he feels like he's nothing. And the film forces us to ask ourselves some tough questions. How much do we define our own worth by those same external markers? What happens when those things are gone? It's a very unsettling thought.
Yeah, it's a real wake-up call. And the critique also mentions this deeply existential vein that runs through the film. Javier is portrayed as increasingly detached from reality, losing his moral compass in this desperate attempt to reclaim his past life. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? Is there a point where we become so obsessed with what we've lost that we lose ourselves in the process?
Oh, absolutely. And the film doesn't shy away from the consequences of that kind of obsession. Javier's actions become increasingly destructive, both to himself and to others. He's so fixated on getting back what he's lost that he loses sight of everything else, his morality, his relationships, even his own sanity.
The film seems to ask this really challenging question. Does this relentless pursuit of more, this obsession with image and status, inevitably lead to destruction? It's a pretty dark assessment of human nature.
It is. And the film doesn't offer any easy answers. It suggests that this constant striving for more, this addiction to validation and control, can indeed lead down a very dark path. And it's not just the individual who suffers. The people around them, the people they love, they get caught in the crossfire.
The critique also brings up an interesting point about addiction itself, suggesting that Javier's behavior isn't just about wanting an apartment, but it's more like an addiction to validation, control, and the idea of success. I think that's a really insightful way to look at it.
It reframes the whole narrative, doesn't it?
Yeah.
He's not just a guy who wants his old apartment back. He's an addict, and his drug of choice is success. He needs that feeling of power, of control, of being on top. And his actions, his manipulations, they're all just attempts to get his fix.
And there's this underlying social commentary too, right? The critique points to the role of class and social disparity and Javier's resentment toward a system that seemingly lifted him up only to discard him later.
That resentment is palpable throughout the film. It simmers beneath the surface. He feels betrayed by the system, like he played by the rules and still lost everything. And that anger, that sense of injustice, fuels his actions. He's lashing out at the world that he feels has wronged him.
Now, it's important to note that the critique isn't entirely uncritical of the film. They do point out some flaws and narrative weaknesses. Specifically, they mention some contrivances in the ending and some plot points that require a significant suspension of disbelief, particularly regarding how easily Javier manages to infiltrate the lives of the new tenants.
Yeah, there are definitely a few moments where you have to kind of roll your eyes and go with it. The critique suggests that while the film excels at the psychological character study, the plot mechanics aren't always as strong.
And they also point to a redundant subplot that they feel detracts from the overall impact of the story. They describe it as a particularly grotesque moral compromise that doesn't really add much to our understanding of Javier's character. It's almost like they're trying too hard to shock the audience.
Yeah, it feels a bit gratuitous, like they're hitting us over the head with something that's already been established through subtler means. The critique argues that the film would have been stronger without it.
So as we wrap up our deep dive, what would you say are the key takeaways from The Occupant based on this critical analysis we've been discussing?
Well, it's a powerful and disturbing film that really gets under your skin. It's a study of obsession, of loss, of the fragility of identity. And it's a cautionary tale about the dangers of defining our worth by external markers of success.
And despite those narrative flaws, the critique still recognizes a lot of value in the film, right?
Absolutely. They praise the performances, especially Gutierrez, the atmosphere, and the pacing. It's a slow burn, but it's a burn that lingers long after the credits roll. The critique recommends it for viewers who appreciate psychological thrillers that prioritize mood and character over cheap thrills.
So for those of you listening, The Occupant offers this really unsettling look at what can happen when our sense of self becomes too entwined with external things, with possessions and achievements. It's a film that stays with you, that makes you think about how you define your own worth, and about the dangers of attaching too much importance to those external markers of success.
Yeah, it's thought-provoking. It leaves you with this lingering question. In a society that's constantly telling us to strive for more, to achieve more, to acquire more, how can we build a sense of self that isn't so easily shattered when those things are taken away? It's a tough question, but it's one worth asking. And this film, even with its imperfections, gives us a lot to think about.
Food for thought, for sure.
Definitely. And maybe a little bit of existential dread on the side.
Well, that's what we're here for. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into The Occupant. We'll be back soon with another film to dissect. Until then, happy watching.
And
Ever get that feeling like you just got to know more about something? Go beyond the surface.
Absolutely.
Well, we're with you. This is The Deep Dive, and today we're taking a look at something that caught your attention. The 2020 thriller, The Occupant.
Or Hogar, as it's known in Spanish.
Right. Hogar. There's just something about this film that makes you want to dig deeper, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. And I think what makes it even more intriguing are the behind-the-scenes details, the things that really give you a new perspective on the film.
Exactly. The stuff you wouldn't necessarily pick up on just from watching it.
Like production choices, inspiration, all of that. It adds so much depth.
So let's dive into it, shall we? Let's start with something that really struck me. That Barcelona apartment. I mean, it was stunning, wasn't it?
Oh, incredibly so. And what's even more amazing is that it wasn't a set.
Wait, really?
Yeah, it was a real luxury apartment, an actual location.
Wow.
And that wasn't just for authenticity,
Uh,
The directors specifically chose a real apartment to represent something,
yeah.
to symbolize that kind of aspirational yet unattainable success.
Which plays a huge part in Javier's whole, breakdown.
Exactly. I mean, it's a tangible reminder of everything he's lost.
It's like the apartment itself becomes a character almost.
In a way, it does.
Mm.
And speaking of Javier, can we talk about Javier Gutierrez for a second?
Please. The actor? Oh, his transformation was incredible.
Incredible, right. And it was all very deliberate. He lost a significant amount of weight, changed his posture, everything.
Yeah, I noticed that. He seemed to shrink almost.
Exactly. The physical changes were meant to directly mirror Javier's mental and emotional decline.
I never thought about it like that. It's like his obsession is literally consuming him.
It is.
Yeah.
And it adds a layer of realism, don't you think?
Yeah.
Makes his descent all the more believable.
Totally. It's like you're watching someone unravel right before your eyes.
Now let's shift gears a bit. Another fascinating aspect is the title change, from Hogar to The Occupant.
Yes. Hogar, meaning home in Spanish. I did wonder about that.
The original title, Hogar, has a certain nostalgic feel to it. It evokes a sense of longing. But The Occupant, that immediately shifts the focus, doesn't it?
It does. Much more thriller-esque.
It implies intrusion, possession, even, appealing to a wider audience, perhaps. A bit more suspenseful. What do you think? Did something get lost in the translation, so to speak?
It's interesting because with Hogar, you almost empathize with Javier more, in a way.
You do. You understand his longing for what he's lost.
But The Occupant, you see him as the intruder.
Precisely. It casts him in a different light from the very beginning.
It's fascinating how a single word can change the entire feel of a film.
Absolutely. Now, speaking of Javier, I think it's worth noting that his character isn't just some figment of the director's imaginations.
Oh, really?
No, they drew inspiration from real life, from middle-aged professionals who lost their jobs after the 2008 financial crisis.
Wow, that's heavy.
It is. They interviewed people, researched their stories, their struggles with identity, with status, with loss.
And they kind of poured all of that into Javier.
Exactly. They wanted his desperation, his downward spiral, to feel authentic.
Which it absolutely does. You can feel that underlying tension throughout the entire film.
And that brings us to another crucial element: sound. The sound design in The Occupant is masterfully done.
I was going to say, it's not just what you see, it's what you hear.
Right. They use everyday sounds, things you wouldn't normally even notice. A creaking floorboard, a notification on a phone, muffled conversations.
Mm-hmm.
But they amplify them. They let them linger. And it creates this constant sense of paranoia.
It's like you're always on edge, waiting for something to happen.
Exactly. And it reflects Javier's own state of mind, his obsessive surveillance, his inability to let go.
It's so subtle, but so effective.
It is. All these seemingly small details come together to create a truly unsettling atmosphere.
So let's recap. We've got this real apartment, a symbol of lost success. We've got Javier Gutierrez's physical transformation mirroring his character's breakdown. We've got the title change, shifting the focus from nostalgia to intrusion. We've got real-world economic anxieties shaping the narrative. And we've got sound design that just amps up the tension.
And it all comes together to create this incredibly compelling and thought-provoking film.
It really does. And it makes you think, doesn't it, about the choices filmmakers make, the stories they're trying to tell.
It does, and it makes you wonder, how many other films have these hidden layers waiting to be discovered?
Right. What subtle details might we be missing?
Exactly.
So the next time you watch a film, take a moment to consider the behind-the-scenes elements. You might be surprised at what you find. And until next time, keep diving deeper.
Keep exploring.